There's something about applying myself, going through hardship and suffering, and able to create something of value in the world. That seems to me to be a specific thing from men. In Orthodox theology, every single part of our life, your working career included, especially, is not just a secular thing, but this is a part of your being in the world as a prayer forming a relationship with God. It's about the transformation of reality into the kingdom of heaven through our being here. And I think that's what's being lost. And that's why we have so many men today who are just completely disconnected. Father John Strickland, great to have you on here again. And what do you say? Christ is risen, and happy. We're celebrating the Theotokos and the life-giving spring today.
Yes, indeed, he is risen. This is a wonderful day. Yeah, end of bright week. We've had a great week here. And I hope you've had a good week where you are as well.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. How was your Easter for an Orthodox priest? Probably with a lot of young men coming and visiting you these
There
days, I
were,
can
yeah.
imagine.
Yeah, I think we had 9 young men convert on Holy Saturday. We always do it on Holy Saturday, the baptisms.
Mhm.
But we had, in addition to 9 young men, we had about 9 women or girls come in as well. Some of the women were actually in our parish married, and their husbands are not much interested yet. Anyway,
Ah,
they're kind of interested, but not really. And as the women who are kind of let's become Orthodox. So
wow.
that is unusual, though, and we might want to talk about that in our conversation today. But yeah, throughout I know throughout the circles that I'm involved in, certainly in the Orthodox Church in America, there is a real flood of interest and inquirers, many of them catechumens. We still have lots of catechumens who are awaiting
Mhm.
reception, but this year we at our parish had about 18 baptisms and chrismations. Yeah.
Fantastic, fantastic. Yeah, and my hope with this conversation is that we can be looking at the relationship between us, the state of our society today, which I think is
Yeah.
what's driving a lot of these people into the
Yeah.
Orthodox Church.
Absolutely.
And then I've noticed that a lot of people are interested in this idea about tradition. They've realized that this kind of like idea that, oh, everything's just getting better all the time, there's something wrong there. And maybe there's something from our forefathers that's valuable. And so I'm looking to make this connection between tradition to Christendom, which I've learned about so much from your books right over there that I've been reading and really got so much value out of. I actually have a review of the first one online for anybody who's interested. Um, and then also specific to the Orthodox Church. That's also my goal, which I believe is the true roots of the real gold of tradition
Hmm.
somehow. So I don't know how, let's see how far we get talking about all of that. I'll just mention as well, though, on the little island where me and my wife moved some 5 years ago. When we moved here, we were the only Danish converts who were Orthodox Christians in on this island, as far as we know. It's about 1 million people living here. And then last year, I got a godson. There was one more man, but young man baptized as Orthodox, and now there was like 5 or 6 that were baptized this Easter. So we're just getting more and more. Obviously, our 2 children are also Orthodox, so there was
So
four.
you're doubling in size, if not more. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
certainly, yeah. So it's exciting.
That's
Okay,
great. It is wonderful.
yeah, yeah. Um, so maybe let's dive straight into maybe give a little bit of an overview of your you have the book, the series of books is called Paradise and Utopia. Um, what and it's about Christendom. Is that right? Can you tell us how would you define Christendom, and why is it relevant for young men today, do you think?
Yeah, yeah, sure. Okay. Well, so yes, I taught college history. I was trained as a Russian modern European historian, modern especially, and I love European history, Western European history, its culture, its arts, and things like this. It's just fascinating. For about a quarter of a decade, I taught college history classes. And along the way, as an Orthodox Christian, I became Orthodox during the course of all of that. I found myself in Russia for a couple of years, living in Petersburg to research my doctoral dissertation, and converted there to Orthodoxy, and then entered seminary, became a priest, and now I'm a pastor full time instead of being a professor. So I really had a chance for a long period of time to think about the history of the West in which I live.
Mhm.
I have functionally no contact whatsoever with Russia or Eastern Europe in my family lineage. There,
Mhm.
my one of my aunts claims that we descend from Saint Vladimir, which I love the thought of, but there's certainly no living kind of experience in our family of this. This is just out of the blue kind of thing. She did a genealogical search.
Mhm.
So I'm as Western as you get. I mean, I was raised in Orange County, California, which is the homeland of the skateboard and surfing and punk rock, and I was part of all that stuff growing up in the 70s and 80s, and never thought of myself as anything but someone living in the West, Protestant nominally, and I fell in love with history and wanted more and more to enter into it, to participate in it somehow, because there's so many treasures of human greatness there, so many exciting, exhilarating human experiences that growing up in Orange County, California, you just don't get. And so I really, really loved the dignity and the excitement that the historical record of Europe, of the West, of America had. And so I studied this. But as a Christian, and then as an Orthodox Christian, I was especially aware that, of course, the this history along the way became less and less Christian, and it certainly became non-Orthodox. And I was interested in how that came about,
Mhm.
especially because more and more people in our time, late 20th, early 21st century, I can't believe we're actually now a quarter of the way through the 21st century. Can you imagine?
Yeah.
It seems like we're
Yeah.
just commemorating the end of the 20th century. Now we're a quarter of the way
Yeah.
through the 21st. It's obvious that there are really big problems in the West, really big problems, really
Mhm.
big moral problems, societal, political problems, cultural problems, and those problems, for me, I'm pretty convinced, and I know a lot of other people are convinced, have a spiritual origin, a spiritual origin. We didn't just go wrong somewhere along the way, like, maybe the 60s were a little too crazy or something like that. It's much deeper than that.
Yeah.
So as an historian in the English language of the West, but one who's an Orthodox Christian, I had and have had, I think, a pretty unique perspective on the history that I tell in my book series. And no one else has really written this history this way. Of course, there are plenty of good histories of the West that are out there, some of them fascinating and wonderfully well written and so forth. But I don't think I can come up with anything that's not written from one of maybe three, maybe four broad perspectives. And those perspectives in terms of like the origins of them are either a Roman Catholic perspective, which, kind of sees the Roman Catholic Church as kind of the, you know, the origin of what we call Western civilization. And of course, there are a lot of things in the West that have a Roman Catholic origin. A Protestant historian's perspective on things.
Mhm.
We could go further down the line to what you might call a kind of secular view of things, especially one that seeks human rights and expansion of autonomy and human freedoms and cultural flowering and secular kind of glory and political strength. And we might add just a fourth, which is one which doesn't see any value at all in any of it, and is very, very critical of it.
Mhm.
Just sees, institutions of oppression and that are endemic and systemic, whether it be racism or anything else. This
Yeah.
kind of, often feeds into, although it's not intended this way, these people want good things, but it often feeds into a kind of a nihilistic, a very negative view of the West.
Mhm.
And those four perspectives are not what I hold at all as an Orthodox Christian. And so instead of seeing like the sexual revolution as being the cause of what went wrong, which a lot of people do, instead
Mhm.
of seeing something like the so-called Enlightenment and the secularization of the West as what went wrong, as a lot do, or the Protestant Reformation as breaking up the Catholic unity of the West, or even of the Roman Catholic Church's late scholastic development around a school called nominalism, which began to subvert confidence in being able to know and value things in the world. My perspective on the history of the West is what went wrong. What went wrong is that the West ceased to have a living relationship with the East. The West ceased to be Orthodox Christian. And that event, of course, is called the Great Schism of 1054. Nothing happened in that one year that determined everything. It was a process that took centuries to unfold, but it's a handy date to use when there was a severance of Eucharistic sacramental communion that eventually affected both halves of Christendom, the Eastern Orthodox half and the Western Roman Catholic and later Protestant half.
Mhm.
And I really think that that mattered. And I've never seen anyone write a history of the West which places so much emphasis upon the Great Schism, the Great Division, and the cultural consequences of that event. And if one goes beyond that Great Schism into the first millennium, so here we're dealing with really two millennia, right? The first millennium, from Pentecost to the 11th century, call it 1054 if you want, and then everything since 1054, everything in the second millennium, almost everything we say about the West, it seems in the books that I just kind of alluded to, and the podcast histories you can watch, and the movies, and the cultural consciousness, almost everything that we would call the West, its content, belongs to that second millennium. Like it's all determined by what we understand to be the West since the Great Division, since that severance of communion with the Orthodox Church. Whereas before, half of our history, 1,000 years of the history of the West, was lived out as an Orthodox civilization. I call it Christendom, a civilization that directed its members toward the heavenly transformation of this world or cosmos, a civilization that placed and legitimated a conviction born within traditional Christianity, a conviction that because of the incarnation and the sacramental life of the church, heaven has come into this world. The world will never, ever be paradise. I use the term paradise a lot, but I don't mean it in this sense. The world will never become paradise. It can't become paradise, but it can begin to participate in paradise through the sacramental life of the church planted at Pentecost. And it was only the disruption of that sacramental life with the Great Schism that gave rise to what we now consider the real content of the history of the West and its various phases. And we find ourselves today in a very, very difficult situation where men can decide to become women, and many other things are happening all around us that are just mind-blowing. How can this come about? How can this be? And so
Mhm.
I tell the history of the West from the perspective of the East, from the perspective that remembers that there was a time when the West was Eastern, and that was the first millennium. And as glorious and exciting and wonderful as that modern history of the West is that I like so much, nevertheless, it was on a trajectory that ultimately led us to where we are today.
Yeah. And I think that's why I found so valuable about reading those books is that there's a very, very clear red thread where you can see exactly where some of the ideas that are, really just going crazy at the moment, you kind of trace back the roots and origins of those back to, very few small single things that kind of have grown and developed from there. So I don't know if we probably don't have time to dive into all of them, but there's two things I'd like to do before we move on in the conversation, and that's one to look at this term tradition and try to understand what do we mean by that? How do you use it in your work? I'm still trying to find like exactly how we're using it as well. And then I also like to understand like what would you say are the key innovations that happened in the West that somehow removed us from, you spoke about like there was an authentic sacramental understanding of life and being in this time of when the church was oriented towards paradise to where we are today. And so what was the thing that shifted that we lost somehow? So I'm not sure which one you want to pick up first.
Well, you use the word tradition a lot in your own work, which I really like, and I use the word in the book series and the way I understand the history of the West. So maybe we should start with that concept of tradition.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I mean, I'm looking at it really just as a rock of stability in the face of progressivism, where you're saying, as you mentioned, like where there's a wave running over us right now, that people are just noticing like nothing's stable. There's nothing I can really build my life on. When me and my current wife, where we kind of looked at each other when we are still dating, and we're like, okay, well, how can we create something that we know can last the rest of our lives? And just looking at each other and knowing like where we'd come from ourselves, we knew we needed something that was very, very strong and stable and trustworthy. And so we went on
Yeah.
that search. And that's actually what led us then to come to the Orthodox faith. I would say that was the central part. It's like we knew we wanted to build something that we could just that could stand, that had stood the test of time. And
Mhm.
so I think tradition was an entrance into what I would then call holy tradition or something like that, because obviously traditions are many things. Realize
Mhm.
like that I grew up in a culture, even in my church, growing up as a Protestant, tradition was looked very negatively upon as something bad and controlling and oppressive and associated with tyranny or systems of control or something like that. It's very much became the traditions of men that define tradition.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
so and so so it was quite a light going on for me, realizing like, no, tradition is a living, dynamic thing that doesn't require blind faith, but it's quite something. But it's something about being passed down from generation to generation in a
Hmm.
personal, embodied way. That's the way I'm more and more seeing it. It's very personal, and it's kind of like in natural, organic relationship that tradition actually gets passed on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what the word means, right? In Greek, a word used in the New Testament, despite what some anti-tradition Christian groups, especially Protestant ones who are used to just sometimes in Protestant circles, and these are tend to be the extreme, not the norm. Most Protestants, I don't think would think this way, but there's this idea that tradition is the enemy, that you just said enslaved or entrapped in tradition, and the scriptures liberate one from that because they show things just as they are. But the scriptures actually point us to tradition. I mean, Paul in his one of his epistles to the Thessalonians says, "Hold fast to those traditions I've given you, both in writing, like my epistles, like this one, but also by word of mouth. Hold fast to those traditions." And that word gets translated interestingly. Some Protestant translations, like doctrinally, Protestant translations of the New Testament will actually use the word paradosis, which appears there in the original Greek that Paul wrote in. It will change that. It won't render that in the English word tradition, but rather teaching.
Mhm.
Like, hold fast to those teachings I've given you. Like, oh, teaching. We can say yes to teaching, but no to tradition. And then elsewhere, when the traditions of men, and you alluded to that passage of Paul, that there are traditions of men that are toxic.
Mhm.
Then the word tradition is used because the word tradition is a word that those particular Christians love to hate. But in fact, I mean, we don't want to get too far into the probably the place of tradition in Christianity as such, but there's no way to have the scriptures without tradition. For a generation, no scriptures were written down until Paul started writing his contributions to what became the New Testament. For a generation, Christians were being saved from Pentecost, for 30 years or more. They were being saved, they were finding salvation, communion with God without any scripture whatsoever. And that furthermore, there are 27 books to the New Testament because there was a tradition alive in the church in the years after the first century when the New Testament was written. There was a tradition alive in the church that made it clear that the books beyond those 27 that were canonized were spurious, like the Gospel of Thomas or other books like that. And so they weren't collected together into what became a 27 book New Testament. No first century Christian spoke of the New Testament in terms of a body of 27 books because they didn't have them. They
Yeah.
didn't they weren't put together for centuries. and it required the church following her traditions, guided by overseers known as bishops, to finally conclude these 27 books are Holy Scripture and the Gospel of Thomas is not. And it required a tradition to be able to do that. So this whole idea of, being hostile or negative toward tradition, it's just incoherent. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah. So what does one say to a young man? I actually had one guy, I put out an article about tradition and he replied like, "Oh yeah, I'm really looking at wisdom traditions these days, and I've especially found so much inspiration from animism," or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know what to say to him. Haven't responded, but
Well, if you're
obviously,
starting at zero, I think if you're starting at zero, like you have no contact with tradition, and that's kind of where our society is right now. My last volume of the 4-volume History of the West is called The Age of Nihilism. Nihil, of course, means nothing, right? And it starts with a reflection on Friedrich Nietzsche and his philosophizing with a sledgehammer,
Mhm.
and how his philosophizing with a sledgehammer, destroyed everything. That was kind of, in a sense, his goal. And so much of the culture of the 20th century, 21st century has become nihilistic, where there's zero, nothing. If you're starting with that, right? If you're starting with absolute zero, like Zarathustra coming down from the mountain and saying, and don't take what I said, to heart, go figure it out yourselves. Start at zero.
Mhm.
That's Nietzsche. If that's the case, then I can understand why someone would be attracted toward just about anything they came across that is part of a tradition,
Mhm.
whether it be animistic or pagan, neo-pagan, whatever,
Mhm.
because at least there's something there, right?
Yeah.
There's not nihil.
Yeah.
But what I would say about us Christians, and certainly I'm speaking here as an Orthodox Christian, is we have a tradition that was intact and has been intact from the beginning, from Pentecost for 2 millennia.
Mhm.
The word tradition in Greek, that's used in the New Testament, in the epistles of Paul, for instance, that word, paradosis, means that which is handed on. And as I understand it, I don't read Latin. I don't know Latin, but I know enough to know that that's what the word tradition, from which in English we get the word tradition, traditio, I think it is.
Mhm.
This is also basically the same meaning. That
Mhm.
which is handed on. There's a passage, it's really wonderful, concise passage of Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the first 3 verses. That's all one needs to read to see this. And Paul basically says, I have handed on to you that which is life-saving and salvific. And that which I handed on to you, I myself received. And that's a good image of what tradition is.
Mhm.
Or another passage, Acts 2:42, that from Pentecost and forward, the church continued without changing, without stopping. They didn't do this for 30 years or 100 years. They did it continuously until the end of time. The church continued in continued steadfastly without changing. That's what steadfastly means. The church continued without changing in the apostles' doctrine, the breaking of the bread, the fellowship, and the prayers. It's just a concise account of what church life was from the beginning.
Mhm.
So I would say to someone who's kind of enamored with a tradition that's not Christianity, like animism, for instance, okay, well, there's got to be something, some sort of wisdom there that, fulfills one's God-given desire for knowledge and truth. But it's a tradition that's outside of this unbreakable, unbroken tradition that existed in Orthodox Christianity since Pentecost. And if one is resolving the crisis that we have today, which we could call a crisis of tradition, or we could call it a crisis of traditions because there's so many to choose from in a pluralistic society. Like they all, there's no truth. Everything's kind of its own truth, and everyone's right, and people's feelings are all that really matter. That's a crisis for sure. If we want to resolve that crisis, I think we want to find something we can really anchor our lives in, the way you and your wife decided to anchor your lives in something more than the passing traditions that you came into contact with that you were just relating a few minutes ago. And that certainly is traditional Christianity. Christianity rooted in the tradition, the holy tradition that goes all the way back to Pentecost.
Yeah. Yeah. So the case that what we're living in has always been Christendom. I think that that's the case. Like that's where everything that we're on now is that yeah, how does one explain that to somebody who doesn't feel at all a relationship? I think for a lot of people, like Christianity might seem like a lot of it's just associated with scandal and drama. I think like our media here in Denmark, you'll very often just see in the media like Christianity being, so there's no historical knowledge and understanding of the way things are connected to each other through time somehow. How our
Mm-hmm.
culture kind of came out. Um, I'm not sure if I'm asking. Yeah, maybe there's not. Maybe that's not. It's not possible to make that connection with someone who doesn't see it themselves. I don't know.
Well, I mean, here in America, certainly there's a plenty of negativity in the press and the media about Christianity, especially in a traditional form.
Hmm.
Sometimes you get a sense like, if you look at a really secular minded media network or something like that, that Christianity is legitimated, but it's only legitimated in that it's liberating and makes, people feel better about themselves and about their desires and needs. It's not liberating in the sense of escaping the nihilistic solipsism that is in our culture today, where we're just isolated individuals reinventing ourselves for 70 or 80 years until we, breathe our last and are buried and forgotten.
Yeah,
That's what we want to escape from. That's what's enslaving or entrapping.
yeah,
It's not being part of something objectively and transcendently true.
yeah.
It's being entrapped in our own madness, our
Yeah.
own delusions.
So can you try and tell, obviously we can't get all of it in, but what do you see as the core innovations that have happened in Western Christianity that have changed from that original Orthodox source
Hmm.
from
Well,
Pentecost?
I mean, first of all, Western Christianity isn't in any way the enemy here of what I'm saying is a healthy Christendom.
Hmm.
And I emphasize again, I love the culture of the West. I surround myself with its art and music and things like that.
Hmm.
And so many good things have come out of the West. That's why I spent my life studying it and
Hmm.
wanting to teach it. However, yes, what are the key turning points? Well, I think it's a sacramental, um, it's the loss of a sacramental, properly sacramental view of the cosmos, of the world, of a world that is being transformed according to a heavenly um, a prototype or a heavenly contact or communion or vision.
Hmm.
So the incarnation of Jesus Christ is, according to traditional Christianity, an event in which God becomes human and joins in the person of Jesus Christ divinity and humanity. And by joining divinity to humanity, frees humanity to become what God made humanity to be in God's own image and likeness. That's Genesis, of course. To be in communion with God and to become part of the life of God and to be filled with the very life and energies of God. And so, what happens as a result of that is the church gets to work in bringing about this heavenly transformation of the cosmos or world through the her liturgical life, especially with
Hmm.
sacraments, communion, especially, but architectural expressions of this union of heaven and earth, the temple, which is oriented toward the east, which we're told in Genesis is where the Garden of Eden is located, the central dome in Eastern architecture, which symbolizes the coming of heaven on earth. Later, churches in the West will have spires which point to heaven, and that's beautiful, very beautiful. But it's kind of like another emphasis. Like here, the central dome symbolizes heaven's come to earth. The spires say escape Earth. You have to get away from Earth to get to heaven. You're
Mhm.
pointing up toward heaven.
Mhm.
The apostles, when Jesus ascends into heaven, we just actually had a beautiful mural painted of the ascension on our ceiling at our church here. When Jesus ascends into heaven, the angels tell the apostles who are kind of gaping and pointing to it. He says, why are you looking up at the sky? Don't you realize he will come again the way, he's ascended? Like Christ is always by the Holy Spirit now after his ascension filling the world, the cosmos, with his presence, with his heavenly presence. And that's
Mhm.
what the liturgical life of the church did for a millennium, consistently, more or less consistently, east and west, in Rome and in Constantinople, in Russia and in England. But
Mhm.
after the Great Schism, the very like uncontestable leadership of the East in defining the liturgical sacramental life of the church. The West received so much from the East and was so much shaped by the East. I call the East kind of the cradle of Western culture, really, as well as the guardian of it. Um, when that break occurs, and it occurs with a lot of contempt for the East, and the East did a lot of bad things and stupid things and contemptible things for sure.
Mhm.
Byzantine emperors, having eyes poked out, gouged out, and the eunuchs and all this stuff, was going on. By no means was this some sort of a perfect civilization, but the West really had a contempt for what they considered the Greek East. And they define themselves against that. Like that's kind of a cultural pattern you see in all forms of human civilization. There's a
Mhm.
temptation to identify the so-called other as not you, and you're defined against that other. And the other in this case happened to be liturgically, sacramentally grounded in a conviction that God, as God became human, the world has been filled with heaven. And so the West more and more became a civilization with a supporting culture that did not seek or experience the heavenly transformation of the world, but saw heaven as something separate from the world. And we can
Mhm.
see this if we look carefully at the cultures I do in one of the volumes called The Age of Division that I wrote about the history of the West, the Age of Division from the Papal Reformation that led to the Great Schism to the Protestant Reformation. You see more and more, if not contempt, certainly a detachment from heaven.
Mhm.
Um, by the time you get to Calvin, you get a real reduction of the sacraments, an attitude toward icons, which are windows into heaven in ancient Christianity, proclaiming the gospel that God became human, detachment from that, and a real secularization, in fact, begins to occur. But
Mhm.
even earlier in the Roman Catholic piety of the 14th century, you have ghastly images of the crucifixion that are designed to shake people up and make them feel, guilty and miserable about their sins. And there's a sense that like God is angry and God is wrathful, and stuff like that is imagery of death, the dance of death, the uh, the corpse tombs that are built that are made for people, where you see cadaverous images of people. A lot of this becomes like kind of characterizes the culture of the West after the Great Schism in this
Mhm.
new Christendom of the West. It feeds into the Protestant Reformation, which in many ways becomes even more antagonistic toward the cosmos and man's condition, not only with original sin that's inherited from Augustine, but now, the total depravity of the human being, according to John
Mhm.
Calvin's dogmas or doctrines. And
Mhm.
this kind of just so leaves the West, which was used to this beautiful transformation in the first millennium,
Mhm.
grasping for some kind of like way of seeing the world transformed in a beautiful sense again, and finally decides after the wars of Western religion, like the 30 Years' War, just to jettison Christianity altogether and build a secular, not a sacramental, but a secular cosmos. And that's the
Mhm.
origin of secularization. And
Mhm.
it flourishes for about 400 years until Nietzsche comes along, and by then it was becoming obviously a counterfeit of the traditional Christianity of the first millennium. and it begins to disintegrate by the time the First World War makes it common for everyone to see how bankrupt a secular civilization can be.
Mhm. Sorry for interrupting. If you're finding any value from this conversation, then please go and check out on our website, manifesto.com. We have a network of online groups with men who are working through these kinds of challenges and growing to be the best men that they can be. So back to the conversation. Yeah, so this is where ideology also plays in and starts taking on lacking. I guess that the series is called From Paradise to Utopia, right? So we started with orientation towards paradise, then we create a utopia, and I think that's why we're seeing today people who encounter something with some kind of element of a tradition from somewhere, often with an idea of a utopia in the future. That if we just do this, we do this. Now it's transhumanism. Before it was communism, whatever. Then we're all constantly yearning for a vision of something.
Even Nazism and its genocide was utopian. It was a racist utopia. Yeah, it was a utopia, just like communism is, and just like, I mean, again, I say just like, they're not equivalent. I mean, they're not all the same thing at all. But even you look at progressivism, or liberalism's tendencies to shed every barrier to individual freedom and liberty, and to do what one wants, to the extent that, like, things start happening, things are done. Like, I mean, as an Orthodox Christian, I feel strongly about this. The whole abortion thing, becomes a necessary part of the system, where unborn children are simply an obstacle to one's individual potential and liberty and freedom, and expendable. So ideology enters into this, and the result is that people become entrapped in the values of their ideology,
Mhm.
which values at first seem very liberating. And in the 19th century, when modern ideologies are born, there's a really strong sense of, like, oh, this is really liberating. Like, if you're living in the Austrian Empire in 1848, when revolutions broke out, 1849, and you cling to a political ideology like nationalism or liberalism, it seems very liberating, and had really good results for a lot of people who lived by that. But eventually, it's a counterfeit of the heavenly transformation of the first millennium of traditional Christianity, that traditional Christianity instilled in Christendom. It's a counterfeit of that because it's purely secular. It's only concerned with this world, and man was not made for this world. And what we're finding is that in this age of nihilism we're living in now, if you try to build a world around utopia, this world only, a secular vision of this transformation, you eventually run into the sand. The water, the river just runs into the sand. There's nothing left. Or another vision is you go off the edge into the abyss, as Nietzsche did, personally as well as philosophically. So we're now living in a time where ideology has taken over, whatever that might be. It could be feminine. We're talking about masculinity and things like this. Of course, feminism, plays a big role in the collapse in society of relationships and understandings of male and female and things like this. That also is an ideological outcome of secularization, for sure.
Yeah. Maybe I can try and tell you how I'm linking this to my work with men, and I'm starting to work with this term manliness. I feel like it's a good kind of like not talking about manhood, which is, as you said, man is created in the image and likeness of God in the Orthodox faith, and so that's the place where one really discovers one's
And
manhood.
to
But
continue on with that quote, if I may, just really
yeah.
quickly, in the image of God made he them, male and female made he them in his own image and likeness. So it's like, it's explicit that man, as anthropos, which just means humankind,
Mhm.
is made in the image and likeness of God as male or female, and female has just as much image and likeness of God in it as male does.
Mhm.
So the male, is no more image and likeness than the female is. Of course,
Yeah.
Paul brings this out. He brings this a fulfillment twice in the New Testament. There's no longer male or female, but all are one in Christ Jesus. Like in Christ, right? in Christ, the human being, whether male or female, and there are differences, finds unity and wholeness and equality. Look at a traditional Christian church and worship.
Mhm.
We just had a bunch of icons painted in our ceiling vault at our church here. On one side, we have male saints running along the line. On the other side, we have female saints to
Mhm.
honor the fact that historically in churches, and you still see this in the old world, um, men would stand on one side and women on the other.
Mhm.
Not like the Old Testament Jewish temple where men would stand in the front and women behind them because they
Mhm.
were like second class religious citizens, as it were, in Jewish worship. But but now men and women are equal, but they stand on opposite sides just because they don't want to get distracted from being oriented toward the kingdom of heaven rather than gawking at each other and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But men and women are equal. And yeah, that so your point, I'm sorry, I'm throwing a bunch of stuff in to add to what you said
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
about the image of God, but I think that really is relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's surprising. It was surprising for me to find that the word manly is actually used in the Bible quite often. It's Andrea. It has a lot of association with courage. And women are very often praised for being manly, especially as well as a very positive and good attribute.
Hmm.
I'd say even
Hmm.
today we probably have, I know in Denmark we have more courageous, manly women in the public debate sometimes. I think they also get to say more. Sometimes men are just like, if a manly man steps up, he gets whacked hard in this country.
I like to
Um,
tease my wife. She's Russian, and I lived in
okay.
Russia, as I said. That's where I courted her and married her.
Yeah.
But I like to tease my wife. The Russians have a word mujественно, and it means like I live like for instance when I lived in Russia in Petersburg, I lived near a Ploshchad Mужества, which means square of courage. But the
Uh-huh.
word for courage, mужество, is based on the word for man, muž in
Yeah.
Russian. So I
Yeah.
always tease my wife that, she's acting in a very mujestvenaya way, which means manly way, but it also means courageous. For the Russians, the words courageous and manly are the same.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I also discovered virtue in English comes from the Latin via, which also means man as well, right? So these things are connected.
Yeah.
And I'm going to try and make a connection now to our conversation as well about the shift that's happened in the West. And so in that creation story, what did God gave man to do was to work by the sweat of his brow after the fall as well. And so for men specifically, that is something that, that came after the fall. And that was related to like what we're supposed to do. We're the stewards of creation. We're to look after it. And then after the fall, we had to work by the sweat of our brow as well. And so I think for men, this is something inherent in like, I noticed like, even in periods of my own life, there's been times when I've had uh, plenty of money, but not much meaningful work to do. And it's been horrible. It's been terrible. And when I have something that I can apply myself to, and I know that this is something that's aligned with my spirit, and I can do it
Hmm.
in my work in whatever small way, just like, helping some little person somewhere or whatever it is, everything in my life flows very, very well. And so there's something about applying myself, going through hardship and suffering, and able to create something of value in the world. That seems to me to be a specific thing from men. And I think that this was inherent in Orthodox theology, and
Hmm.
it is that every single part of our life, your working career included, especially, is not just a secular thing, but this is a part of your being in the world as a prayer to, or forming a relationship with God. And so as you talk about, like, it's about the transformation of reality into the kingdom of heaven through our being here. And I think that's what's being lost. And that's why we have so many men today who are just completely disconnected. And what's replaced it has also been a culture of victimhood and self-care, even self-love or something like that, right? Like the ideologies and the theoretical concepts that are coming in now. And I think a lot of men are just realizing, like, I'm really sick and tired of this. I don't want it anymore. Because it's so mushy and sticky and uncomfortable, and it doesn't it clashes with our nature. It clashes with our nature, and so that's my
I
feeling
think
of
you're right
why
on.
when you come to an Orthodox church, you have to stand up, and there's little old ladies there who'll be standing there for like the whole 5 hour Easter service as well, and you have to pray, and you're expected to fast, and you're expected to do these things, and you're not pushed to do them. But there is a standard, and that standard isn't relaxed. You're not, you don't have to do everything right away. But the church has been doing these things for a very long time, and we know that they work. Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, that's my kind of thinking of the crisis of masculinity and manliness that we're.
Well, indeed, and maybe we could even add another kind of facet to, your reference to the curse in Genesis to live by the sweat of one's brow. I think it's a double curse when men can't live by the sweat of their brow. They're prevented by whatever. It could be just unemployment, but it could also be a social ideological system where they're supposed to just not be out there ambitiously working and creating and building and suffering and pouring themselves into work to care for their wife and children if God sends them children. And if they're unable to work or prevented because of a social kind of ideology that means that they shouldn't work, maybe their wife should work instead and they should just stay at home or something. I think I read into that, it's a little bit interpretive, but I read into that man will work by the sweat of his brow, and if he doesn't work by the sweat of his brow, there'll be another curse on top of that one, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah.
So I think that men have to work, men have to be engaged, and if they're not, and they withdraw to just entertainment only or indulgent behavior of whatever kind it might be, instead of work, they are going to be miserable.
Mhm,
It's built into our manhood.
mhm. Yeah. So maybe I can just ask, you work with a lot of men in your parish as well. One of the things that I've noticed, when I was young, then my parents strongly encouraged me to go to what one could call white collar work. And so as a result, I spent most of my life working in front of a computer, in office spaces, very gender mixed, very political a lot of the time. And I think that's influenced me in a specific way. And so 6 years ago, me and my wife, we moved out to the countryside, bought an old farm, and now I still work in front of a computer. But I also have to fix stuff on my 360-year-old house pretty often. So I've learned like bricklaying and plumbing and woodworking. And I'm not very good at any of it, but I can
How
do a
old
little
did you
bit.
say it is? How old?
360 years old, our
Wow.
farmhouse. Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
It's
Yeah, we don't get
thatched
that here in
roof and
America.
half timbering and all that
Yeah.
stuff. The top bricks up at the top and just underneath the roof, they're still like basically just like blocks of clay that have been formed by hand from probably like the local pond or stream or something like that. It's quite something.
Mm.
Um, and for me, that's just, I think it's kind of saved my life in some ways, or just helped me to reconnect to reality after a long time of
Yeah.
living in a big city, in a little apartment with people all around me, and, kind of more and more disconnecting from just the everyday physicality of life. So,
Yeah.
what do
And
you
you
see
get
as that
swept
relationship?
up into an economy, a kind of way of life, a work habit, whatever. I think as you say, the white collar people are especially prone to this, and it's like the reality ceases to be, there. I mean, it's just like, it's all almost. It's almost ethereal. It just doesn't have any substance to it. So, craftsmanship and hard work and getting out there and doing work to maintain one's residence if they're blessed with a residence. Of course, a lot of people don't have the resources to
Mhm.
do that. I do, thank God, and I know my wife would be more happy with me if I was out there doing more of what you're just describing right there yourself. But I mean, we need to be out there, male and female. We need to be, engaged in real life and not. I think the danger is we send our children to public schools. Um, we depend for an economy on stuff that's made on the other side of the planet and shipped here at great cost, but it's still lower cost than if someone, a mile away made it for us, and we have this really strange, unreal kind of world we live in, and it's good for us to use those opportunities that God gives us to 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 recover that reality, that real tangible reality with the world around us. I agree with you.
Yeah. Okay, good. So yeah, obviously, I mean, you're an Orthodox priest, Father John, and I got to say, I had an experience somewhere down in South Africa some years ago about just having this realization that I'd been running away from my own tradition, my own heritage for my entire life of Christianity, and just by sitting down and kind of sheepishly trying to say a prayer to Jesus again for the first time in more than 20 years, I it was almost like for me like waking up. And I think that there's very much an experience of like maybe re-enchantment happening today. So what do you say to people that you're talking to who are kind of like, having this experience of like, oh, there is more in the world than maybe just, the material reality. There's something about spirit and there's something bigger and a meaning behind things. And maybe they're interested in the Orthodox Church or a little bit trying to look that way. What do you kind of give to people? Especially, I think there's a lot of people who have an online interest. They're maybe watching a whole lot of videos, seeing Father Josiah Trenum, watching Father Moses, whoever writes Spirit on Bailey, but they haven't actually made that move to go and visit a church yet as well.
Yeah. I mean, again, that's part of the unreality of it all. Like that we would be able to find our way forward in a spiritual life without taking responsibility and becoming accountable for a spiritual life. Parish church life enables us to become accountable for our spiritual life, for our salvation, and that of people around us. And by the way, it's not just about us, right? It's not just another product we consume called spirituality. The word spirituality is a modern word. Um, we don't get anywhere if we don't go very far if we just sit and think and read books or watch YouTube videos or something like this. We have to be we have to be grounded in a community, a corporate body that has a tradition, that has received a tradition. The 18 people that were received in our church on Holy Saturday just a few days ago, they all received a tradition. They received the faith intact. It wasn't something they just kind of had to come up with themselves. And for instance, maybe they could have just, like in some other non-Orthodox church, could have just said what they believe, and that would have been accepted. But they have to say the symbol of the faith, the Nicene Creed. They have to renounce errors if they're being received as converts. They have to renounce errors. They have to affirm the Orthodox faith. And that is something that they are not, they didn't cook up. They didn't create that. That's been given to them. It's been clarified by the church, preserved by the church, and handed on to her members, her converts, such as us. And so I think that that's the thing is it becomes real when you really step into it and become accountable for it
Mhm.
before others as part of a parish community. And
So
not
you're saying
only
it's not enough to just watch all of Jay Dyer's videos. You haven't received a tradition from doing that.
I don't think so. I don't know Jay Dyer really. I've watched a couple things by him. I don't know him and I don't know, but I'm sure he would not say that. I hope he would not.
No,
But
I've
anyway.
asked him that question actually, and he
Oh,
said,
okay.
you need to go find a parish. So he agrees.
Okay. Well, okay. I don't know anything about that, but I do know that not only does the faith become real for us when that happens, but we support others in their faith when that happens. And there is no salvation without the other. We are saved in community. The old Orthodox just comment made in the 19th century about the West and its Christian individualism was, all this about the individual, finding piety and finding truth and finding meaning in life and all this stuff. The
Mhm.
only thing an individual can do is go to hell. It's the only thing you can do by yourself as individual. To be saved, you need to be part of a community.
Mhm.
And parish life makes one part of a community.
Mhm.
It's realized, it's lived out. Every year, we Orthodox in our parish churches ask each other for forgiveness before we begin the repentant period of Great Lent, where we struggle and fast, as you said, and come to more services and take responsibility for our sins instead of pretending they're not really sins, and things like that, and the devastation we've caused around us by our sins. We have to ask everyone for forgiveness. This is not something you can do, on your computer by yourself. You have to be in a physical, local, topographical community and space, surrounded by icons of saints that have gone before us that surround us like a great cloud of witnesses, with a real physical altar table there. That is an image of the altar table in heaven that the book of Revelation reveals to us, and to be part of something going on across the planet. When we get together at Pascha in the Orthodox Church, we are or even on a Sunday Divine Liturgy, we're doing exactly what Orthodox Christians are doing in Guatemala, where we have Orthodox Christians, or Uganda, where we have Orthodox Christians, or in Russia, in Greece, in Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria, in Tokyo, where we have Orthodox Christian parishes. It's all the same liturgy, it's all the same community, but it's lived out and realized face to face with the people that you got to have a relationship with. And that's why that that's necessary. There's no other way to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, and you speak about the geographic spread, but also it's the same liturgy throughout time for 2000. Well, obviously that we've had, but we're still celebrating the liturgy of St. John, St. Basil today
Yeah.
from the fourth
Yeah.
century in the Orthodox Church. And for me, it's been the most mind-blowing is the way that, all of these people are a part of my church that have lived for 2000 years. They're the Christians. They're as much a part of my faith. In some ways, they're even more real to me than some of the now today living Christians. You get to develop a relationship with these saints that have really become incredibly powerful people in your life, even though
Yeah.
they're not physically present in their lifetime with you. That's something that really was another aspect that I wasn't expecting actually to have it. I grew up in a church that my grandfather founded. And so people always spoke about, like, oh, what would Mike say in this case, after he died, and things like that. And we had pictures of Mike of my grandfather, and I just remember looking up to him, thinking like being impressed by him as this, he was a very charismatic and an impressive man in many ways, and so how much more so when I look at an icon of Saint Paul, my patron saint. I got to buy one when I was on Mount Athos last year, and just like, wow, wow. And I've just been reading his letters again and again. And every time I realize, like, I don't understand anything of what this man's saying. I still don't understand it. But like the little bit I'm getting, it's has a lot of value. Yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful. What a beautiful story you have about your own ancestor who started a church, working with what he understood, I mean, what he was given, what he could function, what he knew.
Yeah.
And by
It
God's
wasn't
grace.
possible for him to become Orthodox, like there was no Orthodoxy in South Africa that was accessible to him there. So it's
Mhm.
kind of exciting for me that I'm living in a time in the West, as things are like getting really unstable, that
Mhm.
now suddenly this gift is opening up, and we're seeing like it's almost like a bit of a floodgate opening, right? And
It
so
is a floodgate. It's really remarkable. And everyone, it's not just our parish here. We've grown like 25% in the past couple of years, even more perhaps. But I hear from other pastors, Orthodox pastors throughout, the United States anyway, that this is what's going on elsewhere too. It really is. I think people just finally had it. I mean, a certain percentage, like the majority still, are not really interested, I think probably, but a lot of people suddenly have learned that the church is here, the church of the apostles, the Orthodox Church is here, and she's not changing anything, and she's keeping intact that which she received all the way back to Pentecost
yeah.
without changing it. That's the
Well,
truth.
thank you, Father John. You've really helped me, especially with your books, to understand the roots of where we're coming from. And I got to say, like reading a history of the West from the perspective of the Orthodox Church was really, really helpful. I've come to realize, like, you can't know anything unless you know where you're standing. And for most of my life, I just assumed I was standing in some kind of meta position and looking at everything objectively. And now I've realized, no, well, the only objective position is God, and the closer I can come to God is through. Then it helps me, and the path to becoming closer to God isn't which ideology I subscribe to or even which church I attend, but it's the purification of my own heart, often through humility, like humbling myself and
Yeah.
and learning to see my sins, and that can help, but certainly at an intellectual level of things just falling into place. The story of your book and the way I loved your appreciation of the arts and culture and the theater and music, the classical music. I can really tell you have a love of classical music when you read the work, and the way it's weaved together. It really kind of brought all of reality together for me, in a kind of knitted things together in a way that made sense. So thanks a
I'm
lot for
glad.
that. Greatly
Yeah, I'm
appreciated.
glad. Thank you, Paul. Yeah, I'm glad.
Yeah. And then I'll just finish off by mentioning that this summer, I live on this old homestead. We're going to have a men's skill gathering, which I think is one of the core things in becoming outside of God, you go to church, that's where you become a man. But if you want to improve your manliness, then you need to learn some skills. And so that's going to be the focus of our summer gathering coming the 31st of July here. If
What are
anybody is
some of the skills that you're teaching or you're practicing? What are some of the
Yeah.
projects?
We have a very broad range of what we're looking at. I'm basically defining man skills or manliness in a way of like, things that people find attractive in men. But we're asking every participant who signs up to bring some skill that he can teach the other participants.
Oh,
And if it can be something very small and basic, so it could be like how to do a good push-up or a deadlift, um, how to change a car tire. We have a guy who's a choir leader. He's going to teach us to do a singing workshop. It'll be kind of
mhm.
festival style, so you can choose what you want. Then I have a couple of experts. I have a friend who works in finance. I have a friend who is a really good martial artist who can teach some martial arts. Have a guy who works as a recruiter, so he's very good at identifying what's needed on the job market and applying for jobs as well. So a very yeah, we're trying for like a fairly open, broad thing. Obviously, we can't cover everything. Aiming
Yeah.
for 50 to 70 guys to come this year. It's going to be the first time we're doing it. So I've had events with up to 140 men before. But this time it's a new
That sounds
idea.
wonderful.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that really sounds wonderful.
good. Okay. Well, Father John, anything else that you would like to finish off with, close word with? Was there anything I didn't ask you that you would have liked to have spoken about?
You provided some really yeah I really wanted to. I wish we could spend more. I wish we'd spend 3 hours on this, but we can't. So I think there are other things to talk about, especially around your project, which I really like, and I really hope that it goes forward and you're able to really reach out to people who are right now hungering for the truth that you're communicating out there. I really appreciate that, Paul.
Well, if I'm able to get out of the way and not do stuff in my own way and let God's will be done, then to His glory, then I think that'll be useful at least.
Yeah.
So yeah, praise God for the opportunity to do this work. I'm busy writing a book, calling it The Path of Manliness, and trying to explain how tradition is useful for that. So that's
Yeah. May
the
God
big thing
guide you
right
in
now.
that.
Yeah,
May that become fruitful. I look forward to that.
yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Father John. Great talking to
Okay.
you, and I hope we can have another conversation again in the future.
I look forward to that. Yeah.